life, but hey, it's the SCA. So, my name is Her Ladyship Claire le Deyare. You were probably told that my name is Claire O'Taran, but I did legally have the name changed a week before 12th night. So after I submitted this, and despite me saying, hey, no, that's not my name, that's how it all got written down. So, that's how life is. I'm from the barony of Dragonsmith, which is not Multnomah County, Washington County, just west of Portland. It's my lovely baron sitting on the floor there.
Lovely baron.
And as you can tell by the new last name of Le Deyare, I'm a dyer. It's a thing I get super geeky about, as y'all know, because you've all geeked out with me already. And when I started looking at the things that they dyed with in history and what I had, there was a couple glaring errors of things I didn't have. One being Kermes, which I still have not gotten yet, because it's also expensive, but the other being Tyrian Royal Purple. And I hunted and I pecked and I looked all over the internet, and there was dubious Google searches late at night, as you do. And my memory's a little murky about how it started, but to be honest, I think the Facebook group actually popped up is what it was. There's a Facebook group devoted to the sacred purple. And in that Facebook group that I joined, I found a man who lived in Tunisia who was selling Tyrian purple powder. So I ordered some. You can see little bits of it here in the little vials. He also sent me the dried hypobranchial glands from 2 of the species. And yes, and shells from the 3 species that are the main Mediterranean ones. He also sent me about 2 grams of the powder. It was a hinky process, so he sent it to me via DHL because that was the best international shipping. He tracked it. Once I got it, I paid him. Once I paid him, he sent me the instructions. Because he was a little worried it wasn't going to get all the way halfway across the world to Oregon. I was also a little worried, so it was safer for both of us that way. His primary business isn't to sell Tyrian purple powder, it's the revival of an old craft. So he was more concerned about sharing the knowledge rather than making a profit on it, which is really great. So that's how I got my source material. And that's how it started out. But I was a little terrified that it wasn't going to work. So when I initially started this project, I said, let's just do a research paper instead. Well, that snowballed a little bit. So I've got this lovely book here by Joseph Dumais. Stuff comes up in other things. I've got various places, research papers. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, to be honest. I really didn't. I know, right? So it turns out that in all my research, there are a lot of misconceptions, and unfortunately they get repeated in the source material. So somebody won't check the facts in a source before they quote it again. Tyrian purple, it's also known as royal purple, or sacred purple, the color of kings, the color of emperors. It means different things to different people throughout different eras of history. So my intent was kind of, along with doing this exploration of the actual dye powders, to try and clear up some of these misconceptions, try to understand for myself what Tyrian purple meant. Because, hey, it's pretty famous, it's pretty cool. I'm excited. So, historically, the color purple would both refer to any shade that you get out of Murex. Whether it's purple, it's more of a reddish purple, it's a blue purple, there's a whole range of shades. Some of which probably not even known to us now because the chemistry of the water has become different. So we may not be able to achieve those shades, but we don't have a lot of extant examples either. And those have faded throughout time and become different colors. So also, people would refer to purple as that certain shade, but they might be getting it from other things. You could get it from logwood later, which is a plant, or you could be getting it from orchil, which is a lichen. They're all going to produce purple, but it's not the same purple. So I'm mostly focused on the Mediterranean species. There are 3, but I also looked historically at how it was used in Japan and in Mexico, because they are similar species, they do similar colors, and some of the processes are the same. So that was a bit of a comparison there. They're all in the family, I'm going to butcher this probably, but I am a botanist, so hopefully I can try this. Muricidae. So they're all in the Muricidae. And they're not all called Murex now. There's a whole bunch of different genera, and they move them around as they do scientific studies to see how they're related, because that's what scientists do. We like to rename things. But I'm going to refer to them as Murex. Whether it is Rapana venosa from Japan or Plecopurpura, whatever, it's Murex in this case. So the main species are Murex trunculus, which is what it was known as a little less recently than now, which is now it's Hexaplex trunculus, because I'm a scientist, I like to have the most up-to-date name. Murex brandaris, or Bolinus brandaris, and Purpura haemastoma, or Stramontia haemastoma. And all three of them are used both individually and in combination with each other to produce a range of shades. Biologically, it should be noted that these species are all very distinctly different. Trunculus is best growing in rocky areas. It's about 100 meters deep, whereas Brandaris is a sandy and muddy substrate, and it goes deeper at 135 meters. And those individuals from the different species that grow in the sheltered bays grow larger than those on the rocky coastlines, which to me makes sense. There's a lot less wind, water, tide, abrasion. There's a lot less stressors in their environment, so they can focus energy on growing bigger. They were usually caught, this is, I found it really interesting, and unfortunately not a lot of info, but they were usually caught with small net snares that were thrown down to that depth, because that's not a depth people can usually free dive at, to my knowledge. And the best time to harvest, as noticed in Pliny, was after the dog star of Sirius has risen, or in the springtime. And that's because this chemical that does the dye is actually a poison defense mechanism against predation. And they will exude that with their eggs, and so you do not want to harvest after they've laid their eggs. So they'll harvest from the spring to the fall when the egg laying happens. And it has been noted in studies that you can dye with those eggs, but that wouldn't make any sense because you need those eggs to repopulate your colony. So the fluid itself comes from the hypobranchial gland, which is right up here in the organism. So there's the main body that's in the snail shell. It's not quite on the front. They do have to kill the animal in order to extract the fluid, at least in the Mediterranean species. The Mexican species, it turns out you don't have to do that. I'll get to that in a minute. And they would harvest both the larger and the smaller individuals. The larger ones, they would be more careful with their extraction to just get that liquid versus everything else that's in the organism. The smaller ones got all crushed up together, and it's entirely unknown what chemicals were involved, but that later got added to the dye process to help with the color. The liquid itself can be used immediately to apply color to a garment, but it is sensitive to the sun, and so as soon as you've exposed it to sun, that's that. So that works on a home scale, but that doesn't work on a commercial scale. So then you've got to figure out what to do with that. And here's where it gets a little exciting with chemistry. The chemical involved is 6,6-dibromo-indigo-tin. And there's the kicker, indigo tin. It is very, very closely similar in structure to the indigo tin of indigo and woad. And so, it turns out the way to do it's pretty much the same, actually. Pliny goes in to discuss the fact that there's different names for different colors that you get, and that's also probably related to the different species. And an interesting fact, the Bible actually mentions couple different colors. They refer to argamam, or to argaman, which is more of a purple color, and teklet, which is blue. And it wasn't until recently that they discovered that the teklet was actually from the Murex, because they had lost the knowledge of how to do it. A lot of the research being done actually is from Jewish Israeli people who are more interested in reviving the colors because of the religious significance that it is to them. Orthodox Jews are supposed to have a thread of purple and blue that they wear. And of course, that's not going to be coming from the Murex today, but they're very interested, some individuals are very interested in knowing how to get that process to redo that for their religious reasons. Also, my apologies, I have a cold, so I'm on Sudafed, it's exciting. Yeah, as it goes. So, okay. As I said before, the species can be combined, and through research we know that you have to be using Murex trunculus to get the full range of colors. And that can be used in conjunction with the others. But if you're just using Branderis or Hemistoma, you're not going to get the full range of colors. So the first evidence of Murex comes from the Minoans in Crete, which totally excites my friend Vesta because she doesn't Minoan. Dye centers have been found in the Isle of Lesbos, the Aegean Sea, Turkey, the Arabian Gulf. It's probably likely that it started happening in various places at once, but there's so little written evidence of that kind of thing, especially since it's dyes, and those people were not going to be wanting to write down how they did things, that we can't pinpoint precisely where it started. Some researchers will say, no, sorry, it was the Phoenicians, but there is evidence in shell middens from the Minoans, and the Phoenicians are the one that then made it available on a commercial scale, rather than a hometown dyeing sort of thing. So that was about 1700 BC. Anywhere from Tunisia, just everywhere in the Mediterranean. I don't even know all the countries, and I don't know what they were called back then, but it's a thing to get into. That lasted until about 300 BC. We've got pre-Phoenician artifacts that show people wearing the color of purple. It can be used as paint, so that does occasionally come up. I have a whole host of research papers that are going into the chemical analysis of extant things to discover what was used on it. But I'm not an organic chemist, and to be honest, I'm not sure I understand some of that, which means you're going to understand it less unless you're also an organic chemist. So I didn't want to bore you with all that information. There's about 60 research papers I still have to go through on this subject. So there's people out there that are clearly more geeky on the subject than I am. They found evidence on the Syrian coast of dyeing because they found a clay tablet, which is pictured there. And it describes the process of dyeing wool with that. I don't know if there is a translation. That is a thing to get into. I found a picture of that pretty recently at the end of the paper. One theory, though, is how they discovered it. So the legend is that there is a god who is walking his dog on the beach. The dog grabbed the shell, and his mouth was purple. Now, I don't know if we're going to subscribe to the fact that these gods are real or not, but this legend does come up in several different civilizations' mythos, which means somewhere in history, somebody was probably walking a dog and it ate one of the shells. That's my theory. Also, probably, there were some broken shells on the beach, they're playing with this thing. My hands are purple. Huh. I want to do that again. That's kind of cool. Which is how I think dyes usually happen in general to start with. You're playing with some plants, you might leave them in your pocket and you go wash them in the stream and they made some colors and you want to make sure how to make that permanent. Eventually, the different cities became known for the different shades that they produced. Tyrian purple is the particular name for the shade that comes from the city of Tyre. Carthage was also very popular. Just various places around the Mediterranean that are mentioned in the paper. I honestly can't get into all of them right now. We just don't have enough time for that. And that has to do with the fact that they're using the seawater and salts from the area. And so unless we knew what the chemistry of the water was at the time and the environmental conditions that were present and had samples from individual mollusks that were there, I don't think we can appropriately recreate the colors that they had at the time, to be honest. There's just a lot of factors that are very variable that we can't control. And it turns out, so, when I say purple, we get lavenders, we get regular purples. That really prized Tyrian purple that the emperor wanted to restrict for himself turns out to be a dark, deep blood ox red, almost. More red than purple, because that is a color that you could have gotten rather more than just the purple of your tunic. That's why one of the myths today is, only the royalty can be wearing purple. Well, when it comes time for the Romans, there's all these shades. A couple emperors go, I like this shade, I can wear it all. You guys can wear these other shades. Or, I like this shade, it is for my household. The rest of you can't wear it without paying a fine. And we find this a lot in history when it comes to certain colors. There are bans. But everywhere I've read, it says they pay a fine, and they get away with it anyway. And why would you want to lose that source of income by chopping off someone's head instead of making them pay a fine? So I suspect that in reality, a lot more people were wearing certain shades of colors than were actually allowed. Oh, I'm skipping so ahead. Look at that. You can once you've done the actual.
I went back and changed it. So
That's not it. I don't know. Alrighty. It's a pretty little icky, nasty mess of purple and chemicals when you're doing it. But you can dry it. You can turn it into a powder like you do with indigo. And it turns out you can use them as paint, which I would like to get into at some point. But my paint mixing skills are very rudimentary, and that's an expensive powder I paid for, so I would like to try more before I get to show that off to you guys. But they have found it on vases, they have found it on murals in Crete. They in later history ended up using it for illuminated manuscripts, which I thought was pretty cool. That's not till they figure out how to do a more shelf-stable pigment, though, which is about the 11th century, so way after the Romans. The Romans aren't going to be making illuminated manuscripts. They know today also where these centers of dyes were, because we find big dyeing basins that are part of the landscape, and then also these giant hills that are man-made because they're just piles of shells. Now, towards the end of the Roman era, the shell, it's been such a popular craze to the point where they actually have a term for it that meant like the purple insanity, because everybody wants to wear purple. The purple is dying out. So what do? Well, it turns out by this point, the Romans have conquered Britain, and in Britain there are lichens that produce the same shade. So they'll either do a base dye with the lichens, and then they'll overlay with the murex, or they'll just sell just the lichens. That's not going to last as long, it's going to fade quicker. But if you know you're buying a knockoff Gucci purse instead of a Gucci purse, and you're okay with paying that lesser price, it's okay. I'm sure they're fine with that. You pay for what you get. Like, we got this fake purple, it's going to fade by next month. That's okay. We only paid a couple shekels instead of 100. I haven't found real good concrete evidence for how much this thing costs per gram. There are statements that say it takes 10,000 individual shells to dye a garment. There are some that say it costs 50 times its weight of gold. I imagine it varies throughout history, and unless I find concrete evidence in the form of some shopkeeper's list that says, I bought this amount and we did this with it, I'm not going to make any estimates. Because a lot of the sources just quote previous sources, and I'm not sure where it starts, to be honest. Half this paper was sorting out misconceptions, and the other half was going, I wish I'd paid attention in organic chemistry. Of the emperors that like to reserve it for themselves, Caligula, Domitian, Nero, Julius Caesar. It waxes and wanes throughout history. Purpurea insania was the phrase for that. It became a regulated monopoly at some point even, and there were strict regulations as to the quality and the color. Because like all things that are eventually commercially made, they want to have a consistent product. Which I find very interesting that is a thing that exists that far back in history. We think of that as a very modern concept. But even later in the Tudor time, when this is not a thing, the guilds, you can only dye in a guild, and it's very regulated what consistent colors you get. After the fall of Rome, there wasn't a big market for that at that point. When an empire that big collapses, there's a big hole. Some people are doing it mostly because they did it before, and the factories managed to survive the collapse of the empire and the economy. But it's just not on the same scale that it was during the Roman times. And once we get to the fall of Constantinople in 13 something, 1453. I Wikipedia'd that number. All I know is it's the. Okay. The fall of Constantinople is the important date, regardless of which year it was. And maybe there was a few sacks that I don't study. Just a few. Anyway, that is the death knell. At that point, there is no more being produced whatsoever up until the 1800s. And then after that, there's this big mythos when you go to the Ren fairs, which are usually Queen Elizabeth. Oh, only the Queen can wear purple. Well, if anybody tells you that, tell them she couldn't have possibly been wearing Murex purple, at least not from the Mediterranean, because it didn't exist. There's a species from Ireland, Muricidae lapillus. There's not a lot of research done yet as to exactly when it was being used in history. I think mostly what's being used during the later Tudor period is the lichen. I have information from Ireland about Orkill imports. So that was really cool to find out, actually. Concrete numbers. This is how much they imported this year. So they're using that. At some point we get logwood from the New World, which also does purple. But Queen Elizabeth had a decree saying, this is a deceitful dye. You may not use it. And I have a few theories on that. Maybe it was actually a deceitful dye because it wasn't dye fast, because they didn't know how to properly apply a mordant to the cloth to make the color stick. Or more likely, she just didn't want anybody else wearing purple because of that mythos that it was for royalty. So there's been several attempts to recreate this process. There are two sources that I know of that talk about this process in the context of being in period. One of them is in Pliny the Elder's Natural History. Now, Pliny was not a dyer, so Pliny wrote down the process, but he either might have been fed misinformation from the dyers themselves purposely, because dyers like to hide their secrets. He may not have correctly interpreted what they told him and wrote it down incorrectly. Who knows? So either all we know is that people have tried to recreate what he wrote down, and he is missing stuff. Just plain up. He can't have that's not, so we don't know how they did it in period because we don't have all of the information. We got 97% of the puzzle. The other source is what is referred to as the Stockholm and Leiden papyri. Simply, they're one collection, but they were sold off to two separate places, and so, but they are generally referred to being as part of the same document. And it states things like 5 drachmas of ore pigment, 1 ounce of urine, 5 drachmas of this other stuff. The thing is, though, I read it, and there's never a distinct mention of murex or mollusks or snails. So they're using the right chemicals, they're using urine, they're using a basic sort of solution. Today we use soda ash, but without them specifically mentioning murex or shells or any of the previous terms that were used by Pliny, I can't determine whether or not that was the mollusk or that was the lichen. So it's a dubious source at best. I would be better off trying to figure out what Pliny did. I looked into Dumais, by Joseph Dumais' work, and he looks at Pliny, so that's where I got one of the information about Pliny. And he's the one that decided it was wrong to start with. So he does a few things, but he didn't really know what he was doing either. This is very new at this point. He does a dye bath, the color precipitates out. It's like, this doesn't work. He decided it was too acidic. He used vinegar at some point. It just tries a number of things. And originally they probably used seawater, but without being able to know exactly what that seawater contained, who's to say? Michael and McGovern decided to do it similar to a woad and indigo vat, and had some success with that. They're the ones that, due to previous research, had figured out what the chemical formula was. Dumais just didn't have a way to figure that out. They decided that the precipitation had to be prevented in order for the dye to work. So like indigo, you can't actually dye with the initial liquid itself. There are chemical changes that happen, and that is what is causing the dye to happen. So if the chemical changes go too far, it won't work. There was some interesting debate about sunlight with this. I know, like with woad, you take it out of the vat and it's green, it turns blue in sunlight, and that is certainly what's happening with the live dyeing on the beach. But I don't know if that happens with the powder that I'm using, or if that's only with the fresh material, and the source for my powder has only played with the fresh material, he hasn't played with the powders he sold, so there's a bit of a disconnect there, and we all need to do some more research. And a lot of chemistry I don't understand, to be honest. So I need to go and pick through that and exactly understand what's going on. And I think there's also more than one dye chemical involved, which would explain these huge range of colors that we're getting. That said, and then there were other ones throughout. It's all very recent stuff, but pretty fascinating, I think. So, on to my experiment. As I've said, traditionally, as with woad, this would have been a fermented urine vat. That's stinky, that's gross, and my husband said no. So, thankfully we have modern chemicals for that today. And I already had some of them. And there's urea crystals you can get, there's thiox. The least smelly method that I've found that I decided to start with was spectrolite, because I've done that with a woad vat. It's got an odor, but I don't notice it outside the garage, thankfully. And I followed the recipe that was given to me by my supplier of the dye powder. I figured that was the safest way to start, and I've only had time for one experiment, but I would like to try with more authentic methods like the fermented urine. And to my Baron. He's into dyeing too, so that's going to be a thing. So I dyed some samples of wool and silk and linen and rabbit in a wool silk blend. And this is the one picture that wasn't in your original documentation that you were sent. And I want to tell you it's because I was going to show it to you in person, but in reality it's because I didn't realize I hadn't put the picture in yet. So there we go.
So can you just elaborate on were these dipped and then taken out, or how did you?
So yes, I'm going to get to that in a second.
Okay.
So the ingredients were the fibers, the purple pigment, water, sodium hydroxide, spectrolite, and citric acid. And the sodium hydroxide and the citric acid are just to fuss with that pH a little because it's very pH sensitive. So I did a little jam jar, 50 milliliters, because the proportions to me were important. I'm a scientist after all. I added the pigment to the water and I heated it to about 50 degrees Celsius on a double boil. This for me was to keep that consistent and not have it rise in temperature too quickly. I know that dye vats are very sensitive to getting to the boiling point. Then I slowly added the sodium hydroxide, stirred it gently, waited a while, checked the pH, added the spectrolite, checked the pH again, and it's a combination of those few things that are causing like with the woad vat, to cause it to be able to do that chemical change to be used. When you do a woad vat and you first put it in, it looks a lot different than it later. The pH was too high, so I used the citric acid to bring it down a little. And the solution was supposed to look like that, but unfortunately never turned out to look like it. And I did it in my garage at night so that I didn't have to worry about the sunlight, just in case. And then once I put the fibers in, I brought them back out again. Okay, there's still purple on the bottom of the jar. It's sticking to the fibers. I'm not sure what's happening. Excitement. Okay. This is why we're writing a research paper instead of presenting the fibers. But in the end, colors happened, and I was very excited. I dyed 7 different types of fibers, and they were pretty much just stuck in the jar with the little tags of the numbers sticking out. And they just sat in there. And came back out, and I did it a couple times just to try to get it to stick more because I wasn't satisfied. So I did silk, a different silk thread just in case one of them was coated or something, a wool silk blend, 2 different types of sheep, a linen fabric scrap that I had, and then some hand-spun rabbit Angora. I'm not a good spinner, and I'm certainly not a good Angora spinner, so I was actually kind of excited to be able to spin that much Angora. The biggest problems that I had while doing this was, at the time, my microwave was dead. This doesn't seem like a big problem, but when your microwave is built in, so's your fan. So the fan in my kitchen was dead. So I didn't get to play in my kitchen, I got to go play out in my cold garage. And that might have influenced keeping the temperature constant throughout the experiment. So I would heat the water and the dye out in the kitchen, and then I'd go out and take it in the garage because I wasn't sure I should be adding the chemicals in the kitchen, and there was a lot of back and forth there. It's frightening. Because one of the chemicals was lye. Actually, sorry, the sodium hydroxide was lye, so that's not a thing I want in my kitchen, really. The problem, like I said, it never went yellowish, so I think one of the following might have occurred. I didn't keep it consistently heated to 50 degrees. I might have introduced oxygen to the vat, which is a problem with woad vats. It will then cause that reaction to go back the other way. The amounts I used might have been too small to be able to properly manipulate. I used 0.2 grams, not a lot. But I only bought 2 grams from the guy to start with, and I wanted to have extra to be able to experiment with later. without having to spend more money. And it's also possible that to get the darker, brighter colors, you have to use the fresh material rather than the powder. So, like I said, it's an afterthought. There are other species used around the world. Purpura patilla, now Purpura pansa, is in Mexico, and that one was. I'd love to go see these guys do this in person. They just go out on the beach, squirt the yarn, put the shell back. Because in this species, the hypobranchial gland is in a different place, and they can actually stress out the animal that will just exude the liquid, and then put it back, and they know that it will refresh itself in 28 days. So they'll just go from beach to beach to beach to do that. Now, unfortunately, in the 1990s, the Japanese figured about this, and I think you can guess what happened. They came in Land Rovers, and now the species is decimated. It's down to less than 10% of what it used to be. But there's a bit of a cottage industry about dyeing. They usually tend to do cotton, and then they'll sell it, they'll make hand-woven garments, trying to keep that alive. There's a new bus route down to the beach, so instead of having to spend hours and hours and hours and hours on a bus and then 8 hours walking, they can get there a lot faster. So I guess the Japanese might have been slightly useful in that aspect. Maybe. At one point, also in the 90s, the Japanese found a small amount of remnant string, embroidery silk, in a jar at a dig in the Hoshinogari Historical Park. And that was their first evidence that Rapena venosa had been used in period, and it did purple as well. It is a much larger species. It's actually on the list for invasive species. So somebody needs to be commercially minded and see if they can propagate this very large mollusk. It's about 7 inches long. So it's a lot larger than those little ones. So I don't know if you're going to end up getting more purple from that than you might out of these, or if the gland happens to be the same size and it's not cost effective for the amount of food the snail eats. I don't know. There are a few researchers, though, who've been practicing with that and have some really interesting color examples, actually, over here, where they've dyed different fabrics with both the lichens that they could get as well as the snail, and then did color fade tests on them to see which one was fading faster. So just to sort of round it out, to let you know that it's not just the Mediterranean that these things existed in, it's all over the world. There are even more species than that, but there's not a lot of research on a lot of those species. Primarily the Mediterranean. They found shell middens in parts of Ireland and England. They found evidence of dyeing as far down as Egypt, but there aren't shell middens there. So later in history, they suspect it was able to have this colored powder imported, so that the shells weren't there. But if you can import the powder, it's a lot less space to take up on a boat than if you're importing all of the shells. That's about it. Yeah, I think we're good. Any questions?
I do.
All right.
I've got some. First of all, I want to make sure I understood this correctly. The recipe that you were using the dried dye stuff was supplied by the recipe came from the supplier of the dried dye stuff.
Yes.
Did I have that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, he's not familiar with how to do a load vat, so it wasn't apparent to him that I unknowingly already had that knowledge.
Okay.
But having not seen his recipe beforehand, I didn't know that it was very similar to a load vat.
Okay.
So now, and I hadn't actually done a load vat at the time. I'd only played with Instant Indigo, and so that was. But now that I've done a couple load vats and I'm familiar with how that goes, I think the next time I'll be a lot more comfortable with the process.
Okay. I was just a little curious about that because I noticed that you added 2 different reducing agents, sodium hydroxide and spectrolite, and I was kind of wondering why. That was just the way it came in the recipe that, he gave you.
I'd like he himself. We've been talking. So in the Facebook group, there's just a lot of talk in general. I have more access to chemicals than he does. He's very interested in trying to figure out how to make your own lye, which I've been telling him information about that I've gained from watching the Tudor Monastery show. But it's such a Mediterranean climate with not very much wood. The Northwest has a lot larger access to wood ash than he does. So,
One of the reasons why pea was so popular.
right.
Okay, I was wondering about that because I've been involved in quite a few road vats, and I've never added more than one variety of reducing agent.
I'd
So
like
I
to
was
do,
just
I'd like to do
a little
I'd like
curious
to
for
do
the
experiments that
rationale.
have just the spectrolite,
Okay.
just the lye,
Okay.
actual pea,
Right.
fermented. But the limiting factor
Yeah,
there,
uric acid
yeah,
crystals.
the limiting factor is not chemicals. Unfortunately, it's the actual dye material.
Yeah.
That's
So-
another thing I was a little bit curious about. That was my last question until I let somebody else have a turn. Which is, were you able to, from your reading and from your research, derive any kind of feeling for what proportion of dye stuff to material to be dyed ought to be? I see some references to that in the list.
That's
That's how much actual.
Yeah, how much dye stuff.
to how much actual.
Yeah, like for what, in dyeing, the weight of goods,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Because it sounded to me like, again, purely, I wasn't there, so I don't know. But
Right.
I'm inclined to think that you may be correct in it sounds like your dye to weight of goods was extremely tiny.
Yes, I think that's definitely a factor there. I mean,
Because from what I saw from Pliny and also from having done things like that dyeing, I'm inclined to think that may be a big
I think
factor when
that's
you're
what makes
lacking a
it
deep
so
color.
frustrating in the case. The royalty might be the only ones that can actually afford to wear that entire garment,
And-
whereas the
no
rest of
kidding.
the population that's rich might be, having a decorative piece.
If you don't have enough molecules to react with each other to get a chemical
Exactly,
reaction.
you're not going to get a threshold going there.
Yes.
It's interesting. I'm going to put something
Yes.
in it as a factoid. During, I believe it was the 2nd century AD, the Emperor Diocletian tried to do a great big wage and price freeze thing in the Roman Empire to bring back their economy. And he had it's incredibly cool if you've ever read it because he puts out and got an entire list of everything that was for sale in the Roman Empire and what it was worth as far as a trade good. And at the very
Does it mention purple?
Yes.
Okay,
The
there's an
very
information I want to know then.
most
Yes.
expensive thing in the Roman Empire at that time was Muricidae.
And like I said, I'm pretty sure it also fluctuates in price depending on whether we're talking about the beginning of the empire or later when it becomes scarcer.
But in the 2nd
So,
century AD,
yeah.
it would be worthwhile since you were interested in that to find out because it is very exactly designated about just exactly what that is worth
Yeah.
in relation to
Like 50
everything
times
else.
its worth its weight in gold.
To
pretty
give you an
much.
idea, as you were saying, you kind of wanted a better metric for how to evaluate how expensive.
And I wouldn't be surprised if Pliny had if they'd given Pliny the wrong information on weight of fabric per weight of dye, so that somebody would try it and mess it up and go, oh, I'm not going to try this again. I'm going to go buy it from these
I
guys.
gathered from what I was reading there from Pliny's thing is that they were talking about the whole. They were talking about weight, the whole
Yeah.
squished,
Yeah.
the whole
So-
squished creature.
This is obviously not a trade that would have been done in the middle of town. When I'm talking about these dye vats, they're putting the whole crushed individuals and the fluid from the big individuals and the fermented urine. It is nasty.
So
Absolutely nasty.
Thank you very much.
Or so I've heard. I haven't done a fermented urine vat for woad either, but
I have, oh my god.
I've heard stories. It's gonna happen.
I have two,
Okay?
I have 2 questions. One I have about your process for did you mordant any of those fibers?
No. So this is a vat dye versus a direct dye. Most dyes are direct dyes, and those are mordanted or not, depending on the subject used. Mordants. When you're using a direct dye, like the logwood or madder, or a lot of plants, saffron, most of the dyes. You can get a lighter color if you don't mordant, or a darker color if you do, or even, depending on the mordant chemical, an entirely different color, which is fascinating. To be a dyer is to be a chemist, and I call it poke with stick science. I will be studying dyes for my whole life and never be done. Now, the vat dye, on the other hand, you are not mordant. The chemicals are all in there together, and that's what's making it stick. And from what I've done for woad vats, I actually have higher success at being able to dye vegetable fibers than I do with direct dyes because of that,
That's
that
very
process.
much a feature of
Yes.
that dye. This is like the fourth exhaust off of the
Yeah. So
And then the other question I had was if we're talking about if you're taking some of the small ones and crushing them, are we introducing some else in it that is
possibly.
that is not
That's the thing is,
because like the shell is
We don't know what the chemical makeup of the seawater was back then. It could be completely different than it. We've had ocean acidification. It's completely different
But
now.
on the other hand,
so
this process
yeah,
was done over a period of about 3,000 years.
yes,
So
yeah.
it must have been something that was fairly resistant to
Well, and I
acid
just
change.
think with when you've included some of the shell,
Yeah, that's
I mean, we would have to do a complete chemical analysis of all of the species and know what chemicals. Well, we don't even know what all the chemicals are in our own bodies, let alone the shell that not a lot of people study.
Everything was
Yeah.
being dealt with here is absolutely beyond my scientific training.
yes, absolutely.
Doesn't include, which makes you wonder, they must have had a lot of fibers.
Oh, certainly.
There's going to be another factor.
One of the really strange things is that I'm curious about funding analysis of conditions because between 1100 and 1200 BCE, the entire eastern Mediterranean collapses.
Yes.
Parts of Greece are only now recovering the population which means they had to hold on to this.
My father used to say that all the time.
They're
Hold on to knowledge
yeah. There is some evidence that they were smart enough, if you will, to go and try to repopulate the beds by discarding of some of the waste back there, and obviously not harvesting during egg laying season. But I think they just honestly the demand outstripped the quantity.
When you're
As well.
taking your popularity from house, did you monitor in it to see and
Yes.
temperature?
Not that much. That's
Just bits.
bits. Yeah. I initially tried using. I have various camp stoves, and I actually tried doing it out in the garage first with a little tea light, but that wasn't doing enough in the water. So there was a lot of failure kind of involved in trying to. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm inclined to agree with a lot of, more variables introduced by the fact of having to go back and do it. Very smart, do not rely in the kitchen.
No.
And I think it's very wise to do that. I did have a question regarding using the little jar. I take it you were talking about, it didn't bleed the way you expected. I take it you were thinking about that kind of yellowy greasy block you get like with indigo or a
Yes.
rose vat.
Yes. I was hoping it would look like that.
So is that
But
somebody else?
that was somebody else.
Okay, that
but
was
that is not what it looked like. It was mostly clear. There was residue, and there was a bit of a purplish tinge. And so, to be honest, I'm not actually sure if I strictly dyed the fibers or if I stained the outside of it.
So you saw a purple type of precipitate in the bottom?
Yeah.
Okay,
That
so
said, there
that
is
indicates that it was not completely
right.
and that is
And I hope to do more experiments to rectify that. But I used 0.2 grams out of about the 2 grams that I had. And he did send me distinctly 2 different shades as well. I believe I used a little bit of each in this one. One was from one species, one was from another.
So as a curiosity, if you were doing a flow vat and you saw precipitate in the bottom, what would you think was the problem? You saw that some of it
I didn't put in. I either put in too much of the chemical or not enough. To be honest, though, I have yet to fail. I've only done 2 more bets, but they both succeeded. So I haven't learned that lesson yet. Yeah, because the recipe for woad I believe is off wildcolors.co.uk, and I followed. I've got very accurate scales, and I've got a thermometer, and I followed exactly what it said, and it works both times. So yay!
So what would you do different next time? You've already gone over some of this. We are running
Yes.
a bit out of time.
Well, I'd love to go visit him and do it in person, although that would be cool. So, and there is actually a remote but possibility of that.
Where is he located?
So he's in Tunisia, not too far from Carthage, actually. He's like the town next over from it. But my in-laws have a timeshare that's not a particular condo, it's a hotel chain, and there's a branch in Tunisia. So, and it's an inheritable, so someday when we inherit it, I'm just going to go, my husband, I'm going to Tunisia for a week. I'm just going to go hang out with this dude. Yeah, but I just go to Tunisia for a week,
Does he, as the person you're calling, has you guys dying of fibers? You just,
Yeah, so
is he just a
these-
collector?
Those are his. Those are his. But he's using primarily fresh material.
Oh, so he's not doing
It's
that.
rather intriguing that he's selling a product that he has himself released.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he's been experimenting with both.
Sure.
Actually, and he's the one that wants to. He's got lye, but is it the same as getting lye from wood ash? So many variables. So yeah. There's not knowing, that's a country in Africa that's so different than America. I don't know what he's got available to him that I'm like, can I send you anything? Like, no. So.
What kind of sense do you have about when you start dealing with Irish people?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely mostly, like I said, mostly the lichens because we've got concrete proof of how much was imported at a certain point. Over a variety of years, actually, there's very definite research done on that. I got the Google Books to display that page for me, but I'd love to end up buying the book that just talks about the consumption of textile materials in general in Ireland in the 16th century. I think that would be a fascinating read. Because saffron's also another thing I'd like to get into learning more about. But and there, I know, right? And there are shell mids. And to be honest, I cannot remember the date for when those mids date if they know. And to know when certain textiles, if they had textiles from Ireland, to be able to date them, they would have to do a chemical analysis of the stories.
The Viking Age, the Norwegian Vikings were the ones that had access to
Yes.
They had access to Ireland.
Yeah.
Swedes didn't.
Right.
Just a quick question.
So I would like to get more into, are they doing the Mexican in our period? Because let's not just focus on Europe. That's cool, but that's very Europe, white centric. Is there more out there about the Japanese? Is there more about this Irish? But primarily, I was focusing on the Mediterranean because that's like the well-known mythos. So,
Just out of curiosity, have you ever done an orchid dyeing?
not yet. I can show you what they look like.
I'm just curious about the process. Is it done as a direct dye or is it bad?
Oh no, they're fermentation. A lot of lichens actually are fermentation. So instead of fire having that, and I found a binder of somebody's handwritten stuff that had about a dozen lichens in it, including 3 on that would do purple. And so he says, orchid fermentation, and then there's notes about how much they use lichens and things, and the various names. So this is not me, but this is a good approximation of color to show you compared to that.
I was thinking that possibly in the future, studying that
Yes,
process could
yes.
also help you out.
I don't believe they're native to this area though, so I'm gonna. But there is a Facebook group I'm in about lichen dyes as well, and there may be trading them. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So still a lot of unknowns, but I don't have local access to any of them.